A hyperrealistic cinematic sci-fi battlefield scene set in a distant galactic empire. In the foreground, a wounded human soldier lies dying on the ground, covered in battle scars and futuristic armor damage, gently holding a peaceful alien baby wrapped in soft luminous fabric. Beside him kneels an elegant alien princess with ethereal features, glowing pale blue skin, and intricate royal armor with gold and celestial patterns. She cradles the human soldier's head with deep sorrow and gratitude, tears reflecting starlight. The background shows a massive interstellar war aftermath, shattered starships, burning ruins and hovering holographic banners of multiple alien empires witnessing the moment. A grand futuristic council structure rises in the distance under a star-filled sky. The atmosphere is emotional, legendary, and historical, symbolizing sacrifice, unity, and the rewriting of galactic history. Soft divine lighting beams from above highlight the human, the baby, and the princess as the central focus of hope and tragedy. Ultra-detailed, cinematic composition, depth of field, volumetric lighting, dramatic shadows, sci-fi realism, 8K quality, epic storytelling frame, highly emotional tone, concept art style, wide-angle shot, 16:9 aspect ratio. She was here because a child's life might depend on it. That was, as it had always been, enough. Her first meeting with Princess Savari HFY was scheduled for the following morning. Mara reviewed her notes until the station's artificial night cycle dimmed the corridor lights outside her door. Then she turned off the terminal, lay down without changing out of her clothes, and was asleep in under 4 minutes. She had learned to sleep when she could. In her field, you never knew when the next chance would come. Vareth was a tall, gray-complexioned Tehari with the careful, controlled manner of a physician who had spent decades practicing in the presence of powerful patients. He met Mara outside the Royal Medical Suite at precisely the scheduled time, which she took as a good sign, and led her through a briefing that was thorough, accurate, and completely devoid of anything he wasn't obligated to share. The facts were these. Princess Savari HFY, 31 years old by Tehari reckoning, which placed her in early adulthood by their biological standards, was 28 weeks into a pregnancy that had been considered routine until the end of the second trimester. At that point, the fetal monitoring data had begun showing a pattern of irregular chromogenic response, the Tehari equivalent of what a human physician might call autonomic irregularity. The fetus was alive. The fetus was developing within normal parameters on every structural measure. But something in the neurological patterning was wrong in a way that neither Vareth nor Asanu could precisely characterize. 3 previous pregnancies, none carried to term, all of them officially attributed to natural causes, all of them apparently afflicted with the same late trimester pattern, had ended the same way. The infant had died within hours of birth, and the cause had in each case been listed as systemic failure without a specific mechanism identified. Mara listened to all of this without speaking. She asked to see the full monitoring data from all 4 pregnancies, including the 3 prior losses. Vareth paused before responding, a small pause but noticeable, and then said that the data from previous pregnancies was a matter of significant privacy for the royal household. I understand, Mara said. I'm not asking for it to become part of any report or external record. I'm asking because the pattern across multiple pregnancies may tell us something the individual data sets don't. If there is a recurring mechanism, I need to see it recurring. Another pause. Then Vareth said he would need to request authorization. Authorization arrived, to Mara's surprise, within the hour. It came with a handwritten note, an actual physical note on cream-colored paper, that read in translation, I have been told you are very persistent. I respect persistence. You may see whatever you need. SV. She spent 18 hours with the data. The monitoring systems the Tehari used were sophisticated, but they had been designed by Tehari engineers to measure Tehari physiological parameters, which meant they were optimized to track chromogenic signals, hormonal cascades specific to Tehari biology, and the particular electromagnetic patterns associated with Tehari neural development. What they were not designed to do, because it had never occurred to anyone to design them this way, was to flag certain kinds of environmental interference as clinically significant. Mara found it on the 3rd pass through the archived data. Each of the previous 3 pregnancies had shown the same thing, a gradual accumulation of trace organometallic compounds in the amniotic monitoring samples, beginning around week 24. The compounds were present in vanishingly small quantities, small enough that the automated systems had dismissed them as measurement noise, small enough that no one had ever thought to correlate them across multiple pregnancies. The compounds were not Tehari in origin. They were a byproduct of a specific type of thermal regulation system used in older generation station infrastructure, the kind that had been partially replaced in Vale Station's most recent refit cycle, but not completely. The Royal Residential Spoke, being historic and architecturally protected, had retained some of the original systems. The chemistry was complex, and Mara spent another 4 hours verifying it, running the calculations twice and then a third time with different baseline assumptions to make sure she wasn't pattern matching her way to a false conclusion. But the numbers held. At low concentrations, the compounds were inert. At the concentrations that would accumulate over a 24 to 28 week gestational period in a confined residential environment, they interfered specifically with the neurological signaling cascade that governed late trimester Tehari fetal development. The disruption was subtle enough to be invisible on structural scans. It was lethal. She brought her findings to Verith at the end of that 18-hour session. She had not slept. She had eaten half a nutrition bar and drunk 3 cups of the station's mediocre approximation of coffee. Verith read her analysis in silence. His complexion shifted through several registers she couldn't read. When he finished, he set the data slate down with the deliberate care of someone managing a strong response. "This is," he said and stopped. Began again. "If this is accurate." "I've checked it 3 times, Mara said. "I'd like you to check it too. And I'd like to bring in the elder healer Asanu. Not because I don't trust my own work, but because this needs to be verified by someone with deep Tehari developmental biology expertise before we take it to the princess." He looked at her for a long moment. His complexion had settled into something pale and slightly bluish. She had learned enough from her preparatory reading to know that this registered somewhere between shock and a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. "The systems engineers," he said quietly. "The residential spoke has never been flagged for infant risk because no one has ever connected." He stopped again. "Because the losses were attributed to biological causes," Mara said. "And the engineering records are in a completely different department. There was no reason for anyone to look at both together." "3 children," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." The silence that followed was the kind that contained a great deal that neither of them was going to say aloud. After a moment, Verith straightened, retrieved his data slate and said formally and precisely, "I will contact Elder Healer Asanu immediately. And then Dr. Vasquez, I believe we need to speak with Her Highness." It was the first time in their brief acquaintance that he had addressed her by her title rather than her name alone. Mara nodded. She picked up her data tablet and followed him down the corridor, her footsteps quiet on the old ornate flooring of the historic spoke, flooring laid down 2 centuries ago, above pipes and conduits that had been quietly poisoning the most important bloodline in 6 systems, 1 pregnancy at a time for as long as anyone could remember. The Tehari moved quickly once they understood. Within 3 days of Mara's findings being verified by Elder Healer Asanu, who had spent 12 hours going through the analysis with methodical skepticism before emerging from his review chambers with an expression that Verith later told Mara translated, approximately, as the look of a man who has just understood something terrible and necessary at once. The Royal Residential Spoke's original thermal regulation units had been isolated, and the princess had been relocated to a medically configured suite in a different section of the station. The relocation itself had been complicated. Savari ADH Vale was not a patient who could be moved without the movement becoming a matter of diplomatic significance. Every decision about her care was, in some sense, a public decision. The official explanation given to the station's administration and staff was a routine upgrade of medical facilities. No announcement was made about the environmental contamination. No announcement, Mara understood, would be made, not yet and possibly not in any form she would ever see, because the political implications of 3 hereditary losses attributed to a preventable engineering failure were not something the royal household was prepared to process in public. Mara did not push on this. It was not her house, not her history, not her grief to manage. What she focused on was the pregnancy. Now that the source of contamination had been removed, the question became whether the damage already done to the fetal neurological development was reversible. The answer, based on Asanu's assessments and her own analysis, was partially and conditionally, and with significant uncertainty. The fetus was 31 weeks along. There were 9 weeks to go minimum. The neurological disruption had begun at week 24. 7 weeks of exposure, at levels that had been climbing gradually as the gestational period progressed. She and Asanu developed a monitoring protocol together. It was, in Mara's experience, one of the most demanding collaborative processes she had ever navigated, not because Asanu was difficult, but because the two of them were working across a knowledge gap so wide that almost every conversation required them to first establish shared definitions. The Tehari developmental model was not analogous to the human one in the ways that mattered for this kind of fine-grained neurological assessment. She had to learn his frameworks, and he had to adapt them to accommodate the questions she was asking, and both of them had to hold their conclusions loosely enough to revise them daily as the fetal monitoring data continued to come in. She met the princess herself on the 4th day after the relocation. Savari HFY was taller than Mara by nearly 30 centimeters, with the characteristic Tehari bone structure, gracile and elongated, and the deep, still amber complexion of someone in late pregnancy, which Asanu had explained was a hormonally driven state roughly analogous to what humans called the glow of late gestation, if that glow had been encoded in skin chemistry rather than increased blood flow. She moved carefully. She had the posture of someone accustomed to being watched. She looked at Mara for a long time before speaking. "You found what 3 of my physicians did not find," she said. Her standard was very good, precise, slightly formal, with the careful cadence of someone who had learned it as an adult. "I was looking for different things," Mara said. "And I had the advantage of seeing all 4 pregnancies' data at once. Your physicians were each working within a single pregnancy's records." "You are being diplomatic," Savari said. "A little," Mara admitted. Something shifted in the princess's complexion, a faint warmth at the edges, a very slight brightening. Mara had spent enough time studying the Tehari chromatic vocabulary by now to tentatively identify it as the equivalent of a dry, contained amusement. "I appreciate the honesty beneath the diplomacy," Savari said. "Sit down, Dr. Vasquez. Tell me what you think is actually going to happen to my child." They talked for 2 hours. Mara told her everything she knew and everything she didn't know, and the difference between the two, which was considerable. Savari listened without interrupting, asked precise and uncomfortable questions, and did not, at any point, ask Mara to reassure her. She asked her to be accurate. It was, Mara thought afterward, one of the most honest clinical conversations she had ever had with a patient. The crisis came at week 34. Mara had been on the station for 6 weeks by then. She had established something resembling a routine. She had learned which of the station's food vendors carried the closest approximation to the kinds of meals she preferred, and she had begun to understand, not fluently but enough to catch the broad emotional registers, the chromogenic language of the Tehari staff she worked alongside every day. She had also begun, quietly and without making a formal point of it, to run additional environmental sweeps throughout the medical spoke, checking for secondary contamination sources that the initial investigation might have missed. She found one. A secondary conduit in the medical suite itself, not the residential spoke but the new suite, had a hairline fracture in the thermal shielding. The concentrations being released were far lower than what the princess had been exposed to in the residential spoke. They were also not zero. At 34 weeks, not zero was not acceptable. Mara pulled the monitoring data at 2:14 station time and saw the fetal neurological trace begin to deviate. The deviation was small. It was also, given everything she now understood about the mechanism, unmistakable. She called a full alert. She got the engineering team to the conduit within 11 minutes. She had Verith and Asanu at the princess's bedside in 13. She had the secondary contamination source isolated and sealed in 22 minutes from the moment she had pulled the data. At 2:54, the fetal neurological trace stabilized. Mara sat in the monitoring room afterward and allowed herself exactly 4 minutes of the kind of shaking that her body had been storing up since the alarm. Then she stood up, drank a glass of water and went back to the data. The close call had one consequence she had not anticipated. It brought Savari herself to the monitoring room. The princess arrived at 3:15 in a dressing robe, with 2 attendants who clearly wished she had stayed in bed and had no mechanism for making her do so. She stood in the doorway, looked at Mara and said nothing for a moment. "You found it at 2 in the morning," she said. "I couldn't sleep," Mara said. "You check the data when you cannot sleep." "Usually yes." The princess looked at her with an expression that Mara, even without complete fluency in Tehari chromatic signals, could feel the weight of. Something warm and complicated, old and careful. "In Tehari," Savari said slowly, "there is a word. Bathos. It means approximately, the one who watches over you without being asked. It is an old word. An honorable word. Pause. It does not typically apply to physicians. Or humans, Mara said. Or humans, Savari agreed. And then, with the faint chromatic warmth that Mara had learned to tentatively read as genuine, "Go to sleep, Dr. Vasquez. I will still be here in the morning." She did go to sleep. The child inside the princess held on. And the night that could have been catastrophic became, instead, the night everything quietly changed between them. Weeks after the incident with the secondary conduit were, by any external measure, quieter. The monitoring data continued to improve. The fetal neurological traces stabilized within normal developmental parameters and then, slowly and tentatively, began to show signs of partial recovery, the disrupted signaling patterns gradually resolving as the contamination cleared the system and the remaining weeks of gestation allowed for some degree of neurological reorganization. Asanu described it, one afternoon over what had become their established routine of shared meal breaks and cross-disciplinary argument, as a kind of biological stubbornness. The word he used, Mara had come to understand, was the same root as the Tehari term for a river that finds its way around an obstacle rather than through it. She had begun to learn Tehari in earnest. Not the formal diplomatic register, which she had some functional literacy in already, but the clinical register, the precise, compressed language that Tehari physicians used among themselves, built around physiological specificity and an assumption that the listener understood the biological framework behind every term. Asanu had initially watched this development with studied neutrality. By week 8 of her posting, he had begun correcting her pronunciation without being asked, which Varith informed her, with a dry precision that had become its own kind of warmth, was the elder healer's most reliable indicator of respect. Mara herself did not think much during those weeks about what she was doing or why. She thought about the data. She thought about the monitoring protocols, which she and Asanu continued to refine as the pregnancy progressed. She thought about the week 38 threshold, which represented the earliest point at which a Tehari delivery could occur with reasonable safety, and the week 40 target, which was optimal. She thought about the delivery itself, which would require a degree of coordination between her own obstetric training and Asanu's traditional Tehari practices that they had not yet fully worked out. She also, during this period, began to notice something she had not initially registered. She was tired in a way that was not accounted for by her sleep schedule. She noted it the way she noted most things, clinically without immediate alarm. She had always run on relatively little sleep and high sustained focus. She had always recovered quickly. The tiredness she was experiencing now was different in character. A heaviness in the bones, a slight slowing of her own processing that she caught herself compensating for by checking her notes more frequently than usual. She attributed it, initially, to the cumulative stress of a high-stakes posting in an unfamiliar environment. At week 9 of her posting, she ran a routine self-assessment and found an anomaly in her own blood markers. The anomaly was small. It was also, to someone with her background, immediately legible. Chronic exposure to a low concentration of the same class of organometallic compounds she had identified in the princess's environment. She sat with this information for 24 hours before she acted on it. The secondary conduit incident had been resolved. The immediate environment was clean. But the exposure she had accumulated during her first 3 weeks on the station, before she had identified the primary contamination, before the medical suite had been cleared, had been sufficient to produce a measurable effect on her own physiology. The compound class was not well studied in humans. The Tehari literature she had used to understand the fetal neurological mechanism was not directly applicable to human adult biology. She could not know with confidence what the long-term implications were. What she could assess, with reasonable confidence, was her current functional capacity, and it was not diminished in any way that would affect her ability to care for her patient. She made a decision that she documented in her personal log but did not, at that time, include in any official medical record. The delivery was 7 to 9 weeks away. Her own exposure had already occurred. There was nothing to be done about that now. Her health was not acutely at risk. Raising the issue with the station's administration at this point would trigger a review process that would, at minimum, delay and complicate the final phase of the princess's care that was, at this point, critically dependent on the continuity of the monitoring protocols she and Asanu had built together. She was not reckless about it. She increased her own monitoring, ran daily self-assessments, and established a clear threshold at which she would disclose any further deterioration, any indication that her functional capacity was genuinely compromised. The threshold was never crossed. But the condition did not reverse itself either. What she did not do, could not have done given who she was stop working. She did not reduce her monitoring shifts. She did not step back from the twice-weekly consultations with Savari that had become, over the course of 2 months, something she could not quite classify as friendship but recognized as significant. She did not tell Asanu or Varith or the princess herself. She did write to Dr. Bayer. Not the full picture, She was careful about what she put in writing, but enough that someone who knew her well would understand. His response came back in 3 days. You are the most stubborn person I have ever trained. Please make sure someone knows where your medical records are kept. I say this with love and considerable alarm. She left her records access with the station's chief medical officer in a sealed document marked for review only in the event of her medical incapacitation. She did not tell the chief medical officer what was in it. There is a particular kind of person who makes decisions like this one, who calculates the cost, understands it clearly, and proceeds anyway because the alternative is a harm they are not willing to allow. Medical literature tends not to have a clean category for them. They are not reckless. They are not self-destructive. They simply have a sense of proportion that does not place their own well-being above a value they have determined is greater. Mara Vasquez was that kind of person. She had always been that kind of person, long before she had the vocabulary for it, long before her medical training had given her the means to act on it at this scale. She went back to work. She kept watching the data. The child inside Savari HFY continued, stubbornly and with increasing confidence, to grow. And Mara, who had come without ceremony and asked for no ceremony in return, kept watching, not because anyone had told her to, but because that was simply what she did. By the 10th week of Mara's posting, Savari HFY had developed a habit that her attendants found quietly remarkable. She asked questions that she did not already know the answers to. This was not, for a woman of her position in history, a natural state. She had been raised in an environment where admitting uncertainty was a form of vulnerability, and vulnerability was something that other people exploited. Her education had been comprehensive and deliberate. She could speak 3 languages fluently, navigate 7 major systems of dynastic law, and conduct a formal diplomatic reception with the composure of someone to whom the performance of authority was so deeply internalized that it no longer felt like a performance. What she had not been taught, because no one in her world had thought it necessary, was how to sit with not knowing. She had learned it, tentatively and with some difficulty, from watching Mara work. Their twice-weekly consultations had evolved, over the course of 10 weeks, from formal medical briefings into something considerably less structured. Savari had initially conducted them in the posture she maintained for all official interactions: upright, precise, reception-ready. She had asked questions she anticipated the answers to, as a form of verification rather than genuine inquiry. She had thanked Mara for information in the formal register that indicated respectful acknowledgement without personal engagement. The change had begun, she realized later, with the night of the secondary conduit incident. She had gone to the monitoring room at 3 in the morning and found Mara sitting in the aftermath of what had just been averted, shaking slightly, drinking a glass of water, alone, and then standing up and going back to work. Without drama. Without an audience. Without anyone having asked her to. Something in that image had lodged itself in Savari's thinking in a way she could not easily dismiss. She had known of humans in the abstract political sense. The Terran Diplomatic Corps had been a presence in Tehari affairs for 30 years. She had met human diplomats, human trade representatives, human researchers. She had formed, from those encounters, the kind of impressionistic understanding that accrues from exposure without intimacy. Humans were adaptable, humans were emotionally complex in ways that Tehari found difficult to read. Humans had a reputation for performing well under stress that the Tehari diplomatic community regarded with a mixture of respect and unease. What she had not understood, before Mara Vasquez, was the specific texture of it. The way a person could be genuinely frightened. She had seen the shaking hands. She was not naive, and moved through the fear into function not by suppressing it but by treating it as information and then setting it aside. The way a person could hold uncertainty and continue working anyway without the uncertainty becoming paralysis. She began asking real questions. Small ones at first. About the monitoring methodology, about the specific mechanisms of the neurological recovery they were observing, about how Mara had learned the things she knew. Mara answered all of them with the same quality of attention, not the attention of someone who was managing a patient's emotional state, but the attention of someone who found the questions genuinely interesting and was willing to think alongside the person asking them. How did you know, Savari asked one afternoon in the 10th week, that the pattern was environmental rather than genetic? I didn't know, Mara said. I suspected, based on the fact that the disruption was identical across 4 pregnancies but the underlying genetic material was different. The father of the first 2 pregnancies was not the same as the current one. So either there was something consistently wrong with your reproductive biology, which the structural data didn't support, or there was something external that wasn't being tracked. I looked for what wasn't being tracked. That seems very simple when you put it that way. Most things do once you know where to look. The difficulty is knowing what you're not looking at. Savari considered this. Her complexion shifted, the warm amber of late pregnancy overlaid with a cooler, thoughtful blue that Mara had come to associate with the princess's working mind. In governance, Savari said, there is an equivalent problem. The information that reaches me has been processed through so many layers of advisors and protocol that by the time I see it, the parts that were unexpected have often been removed, because the people who handle information assume that what I need to know is what fits the existing framework. So I am always operating on a version of reality from which the anomalies have been filtered out. That's a significant problem, Mara said. Yes, Savari said. I have been thinking these past weeks about how to change it. Pause. I have also been thinking about what it means that a human physician, given access to my medical history, found in 3 days what my own physicians did not find in 3 years. Mara was quiet for a moment. She had an instinct in these conversations, for when Savari was not asking for reassurance. Your physicians weren't doing anything wrong, she said carefully. They were operating within the framework they had. I was outside the framework. That's not a criticism of Tehari medicine. It's an argument for having people who are outside your framework involved in your most important decisions. They see the anomalies. Outsiders, Savari said. People who aren't invested in the framework being correct, Mara said. Sometimes that's an outsider. Sometimes it's just someone who learned to ask different questions. The princess looked at her steadily. The warm amber deepened slightly. You are a very unusual person, Dr. Vasquez. I'm told that fairly regularly, Mara said. I've stopped trying to figure out whether it's a compliment. It was, Savari thought. It was entirely and without qualification a compliment, though she did not say so in those words. She said instead what she had been working toward for several weeks. When this is over, when my child is safe, I would like to ask your government to extend your posting here. Formally. I will make the request personally. Pause. And I would like to understand, from you, what other anomalies your framework can see in ours. I think we have been operating inside an insufficient picture of our own systems for a very long time. Mara looked at the woman across from her, this reserved, formidable, quietly transforming person, and thought that this conversation, this very moment, was going to matter in ways that neither of them could yet calculate. Let's get your child here safely first, Mara said. Yes, the princess agreed. Let's do that first. The princess's daughter was born at week 39 and 4 days, in the early hours of a station morning cycle, under conditions that were, given everything that had preceded them, startlingly calm. Varith and Asanu conducted the delivery. Mara was present throughout, managing the real-time monitoring and standing by with the interventional protocols she and Asanu had developed over 4 months of collaboration, none of which ended up being needed. The infant's first chromogenic response, recorded 47 seconds after birth, was within the lower end of normal parameters. By the end of the first hour, it was mid-range. By the end of the first day, Asanu assessed the neurological development as consistent with a healthy full-term Tehari infant with no residual impairment detectable at current resolution. Mara wrote up the final monitoring notes, filed the last of the medical records, and sat in the empty monitoring room for 20 minutes before anyone found her there. It was Varith who found her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room with the quiet attentiveness of a physician who was also, at his core, a careful observer of people. He had worked alongside Mara for 4 months. He had watched her accuracy, her persistence, her deliberate habits, and her extraordinary inconspicuous endurance. He had also, in the past 3 weeks, noticed that she was tired in a way that was not accounted for by visible workload. He sat down across from her without preamble and said, in the clinical Tehari register she had spent 4 months learning. I need you to tell me what is wrong with you. She looked at him. The instinct to deflect, the one she had been maintaining for weeks, rose and then subsided. The child was born. The child was healthy. The urgency that had structured her logic for months was resolved. She told him. All of it, in the same complete and unsentimental way she would have told any colleague about any patient's case. Varith listened without interrupting. His complexion shifted through several registers she could now read with some fluency. First a deep, cool blue that was close to alarm, then a sustained gray-green that she had come to associate with the Tehari processing of unwanted information, Then, at the end, something that settled into a dark, quiet amber that she had not seen on him before and did not, in the moment, have a word for. When she finished, he said, "You understood what was happening to you at week 9 of your posting." "Yes." "And you continued." "Yes." "Because you calculated that disclosure would compromise the continuity of care." "That was my assessment. I documented my reasoning." He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. "The compound class," he said at last, "is not extensively studied in human biology. In Tehari adults, long-term exposure at the levels you would have experienced produces a pattern of—" He paused, choosing his words with unusual care. "The prognosis depends on the duration and intensity of exposure, and on how promptly treatment is initiated." "I know," she said. "I've read what literature there is." "Then you know that it is not a good prognosis if treatment is delayed." "I know," she said again. Her voice was level. "I also know that the princess's child is alive and well and neurologically intact. Which is why I made the decision I made." Varith looked at her with the dark, quiet amber expression that she still did not have a word for, and said nothing for what felt like a long time. "We will begin treatment immediately," he said. "I am calling in the station's full medical resource for this. And I will be informing Her Highness." "Varith." "She will want to know," he said, with a finality that she recognized as Tehari certainty rather than argument, and which she did not have the energy to contest. Savari came herself 3 hours later and sat beside Mara's bed in the medical suite, the same suite, renovated and clean, where she had spent the final months of her pregnancy, and did not speak for a while. The infant, small and chromogenically vibrant, was sleeping in an adjacent care station. Savari had not brought attendants. This, Mara understood, was the highest form of informality a Tehari of her rank could offer. "You knew," Savari said at last. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact being carefully processed. "From week 9, Mara said. "And you said nothing." "The child needed the continuity of care. The disruption of disclosure at that point would have been—" "I know what you calculated," Savari said. Her voice was steady, but her complexion was doing something complicated, layered. The warm amber of recent birth hormones overlaid with something that Mara, with all the Tehari she had learned, could only translate as grief that did not yet know its full shape. "I need to understand why you chose it." Mara thought about this honestly for a moment rather than answering automatically. "Because your daughter's life was something I could affect," she said. "My own situation was already fixed, the exposure had already happened. Given that, the question was just how to use the time and the capacity I had. And the answer was obvious." "To you?" Savari said. "To me," Mara agreed. The princess looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at her daughter, sleeping with the serene opacity of a creature entirely unaware of everything that had been risked and given on her behalf. "In 3 months, Savari said quietly, "there is an assembly of crowns. Every hereditary ruler in the concordance, every senior diplomat, every advisor of consequence. My daughter will be presented. And I am going to tell them the truth, all of it. The contamination, the engineering failure, the 3 pregnancies we lost, the human physician who found what no one else had found. Pause. And what that physician chose when she understood the cost." "Savari," Mara said. "That will have political implications I can't predict." "Yes," the princess said. "It will. That is rather the point." She reached out and touched Mara's hand, a Tehari gesture of acknowledgement that was, Varith would later explain, reserved in their culture for debts that could not be named in ordinary language. "My daughter is alive," Savari said. "You gave her to me. And I am going to make sure that what you did is not forgotten by any of the people who have the power to do something with it." Mara, who had never in her professional life sought recognition for any of this, opened her mouth to say something practical and deflective. Then she closed it again. She looked at the sleeping infant. She thought about what Dr. Bayer's card had said, "Trust what you see." What she saw, in this moment, was a princess who had learned to ask real questions, holding the hand of the woman who had, without ceremony or announcement, paid a significant price to make sure there was someone to ask. "Okay," Mara said. It was, all things considered, enough. The Assembly of Crowns convened on the first day of the Tehari ceremonial calendar's 2nd quarter, a date that had, for 400 years, marked the formal recognition of new successors to the hereditary seats of the concordance. It was held in the grand deliberation chamber of the central station, a room that had been built, like everything else on Vale Station, across the accumulated layers of centuries, ornate vaulting above modern atmospheric management systems, Chromatic tapestries from 3 dynasties covering walls that had been replicated and restored so many times that the distinction between original and reproduction had become ceremonially irrelevant. Princess Savari HFY entered the chamber last, as was her right and her custom, carrying her daughter, named in the traditional Tehari form Vilasanamara, incorporating by Tehari convention the names of those whose acts had been instrumental in the child's survival. The elder healer Asanu's name had been expected. Mara's had not been, and the formal announcement of the full name had produced a sustained pause in the chamber that translated, by any reading of the assembled nobility's chromatic response, as collective astonishment. Mara herself was not present in the assembly chamber. She was in the station's medical ward, 8 weeks into a course of treatment that Varith had characterized, with careful Tehari precision, as showing encouraging early response. The prognosis, revised upward twice already, was now described in the most recent assessment as cautiously optimistic, which was medical language for not what we feared, better than we hoped. She had read this assessment over breakfast and written in her personal log. Varith used the phrase cautiously optimistic in a report. I am choosing to regard this as a significant emotional declaration by his standards. She watched the assembly via the medical ward's display system. She had been invited, formally with the kind of written invitation that was delivered by hand by a member of the royal household staff, to attend if her condition permitted. Her condition did not quite permit, and she and Varith had agreed on this without much argument. She watched instead from a comfortable chair with a cup of the station's mediocre coffee, which she had genuinely come to find comforting in its reliable mediocrity, and a data terminal open on one side running her morning monitoring check. Savari spoke for 47 minutes. Mara had known she was going to speak. She had not known the full content of what Savari intended to say. The princess had not shared the speech in advance, which Mara had respected, understanding that some things needed to be prepared in privacy to be delivered honestly. What Savari said was this: a complete account of the environmental contamination, presented with the full technical detail that had never previously been made public. The engineering failure. The 3 predecessors to her daughter who had not survived. The systematic gap in the Tehari medical surveillance infrastructure that had allowed the failure to go undetected for decades. And then, delivered with the same factual precision without rhetorical elevation, because Savari had learned from Mara that the undecorated truth was more credible than the decorated kind. The account of what a human physician on a diplomatic secondment had found in 3 days of data review, and what that physician had chosen to do with the knowledge of her own exposure in the weeks that followed. The chamber's chromatic atmosphere, visible on the display feed in the ambient readings that the station systems automatically tracked for large assemblies, shifted profoundly and collectively during the final part of the account. Mara, watching the readout, could identify the broad registers now, the deep, complex amber of something being processed that had not been anticipated, the brief, sharp flare of what she had learned to read as a shame response, and then, sustained, widespread, and remarkable enough that she caught her breath slightly, the warm, particular chromogenic signal that Tehari used for what translated, most accurately, as honor given where it is owed. The Assembly of Crowns passed 3 measures that day. The first established a mandatory cross-departmental environmental review protocol for all station infrastructure in residential and medical use, to be implemented within 18 months across every concordance facility. The second created a formal framework for the involvement of non-Tehari medical specialists in Tehari hereditary care. A measure that, in practice, dismantled the informal exclusion that had made it necessary for the Terran diplomatic corps to negotiate Mara's posting in the first place. The third, proposed by Savari HFY and seconded unanimously by a chamber that had not moved unanimously on anything in 11 years, established what would come to be called the Vathos Protocol, a set of standards for the recognition and reciprocal treatment of foreign specialists operating in concordance space, including explicit provisions for medical care, legal protection, and compensation for occupational exposure. The name was Savari's choice. When a journalist from the Concordance Press Bureau asked her to explain it after the session, she said, in the precise and formal standard she used for public statements. There is a Tehari word, Vathos, that describes the one who watches over you without being asked. It is an old word. An honorable word. We have passed a protocol today because we were shown what that word looks like in practice by someone from another world in the middle of the night checking data that no one had asked her to check. The least we can do is make sure that the next person who acts like that has somewhere to stand in our law. The statement was translated and distributed across 14 news services within 6 hours. Varith came to the medical ward that evening with the expression that Mara had finally, definitively identified. The dark, quiet amber that she had first seen in the monitoring room the morning after the delivery, the one she hadn't had a word for. She had since learned it. It was a relatively rare Tehari chromogenic signal, not typically produced in professional contexts. Something between gratitude and recognition and a particular kind of sadness, used when one becomes aware of a debt that cannot be repaid in kind. "You watched the assembly," he said. "All of it," Mara said. "She named the child for you." "She named the child for elder healer Asanu and for her house," Mara said. "She included me. That's different." "In Tehari naming practice," Varith said with the careful precision she had come to deeply appreciate in him, "the distinction between included and named for exists. Her Highness chose not to make it." Mara looked at him. He looked back at her. After a moment she said, "The protocol they passed today. The Vathas protocol. Yes. It will help. Not just here. Other human specialists working in concordant space, people in situations where they have no formal standing if something goes wrong. This creates standing. Legal standing. Medical coverage. She stopped because she did not typically emote in professional contexts, but she was in a medical ward on a course of treatment, having just watched a room full of hereditary rulers pass law in the name of something she had done because there was no other reasonable option, and the combination was, she found, somewhat more than she had the professional distance to process entirely smoothly. "It is significant," Varith said, quietly and with the precision she trusted. "What you did was significant. And it is now recorded as significant, in the law of 6 systems, in the name of a child, in the history of this station." He paused. "You came without ceremony, Dr. Vasquez. But you leave, when you are well enough to leave, with considerably more than that." Mara was discharged from Vale Station's medical ward 11 weeks after the assembly. Her prognosis, by then, had been upgraded to full expected recovery with ongoing monitoring. She had, in the Tehari clinical register she had spent 4 months learning, argued twice with Varith about the discharge timeline, lost both arguments and privately concluded that he was probably right. On her last morning, Savari came to her quarters. She brought her daughter, Vilasanamara, 4 months old now, and magnificently unaware of her historical significance, and she sat across from Mara and they drank the station's mediocre coffee together in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have been through something together that does not require further description. Before Mara left, Savari gave her a physical gift. A small card, cream-colored in the Tehari formal script, with a translation on the reverse in Mara's handwriting that she had clearly prepared in advance. The translation read, "For the one who watches without being asked, the debt that cannot be repaid, and the gratitude that does not require it." Mara put it in her canvas duffel, next to Dr. Bayer's card, and carried it off the station with her. She had come to Vale Station because a child's life might depend on it. She left because the child was alive and the law was changed, and somewhere in the gap between those 2 facts, without any ceremony whatsoever, a small piece of how the galaxy worked had been quietly and permanently altered. It was not the kind of thing that got its own monument. It rarely is. But the child, growing up on a station that bore her family's name, would carry a name that bore witness to it. And in 6 systems, a protocol built on the word Vathas, the one who watches over you without being asked, would extend its protections to every person who came to do difficult work in an unfamiliar place, and asked for nothing but the chance to do it well. Mara Vasquez boarded the shuttle home carrying 2 bags, 1 standard-issue medical transit case in gray polymer, and 1 soft canvas duffel with a repaired strap. She was 38 years old. She was, by any measure, tired. She was also, in the particular way that belongs to people who have done the thing they came to do, precisely satisfied. The shuttle from Vale Station departed 11 minutes ahead of schedule. The station's docking authority recorded it in the logs with the same blank indifference it used for everything else. Somewhere in the station's residential spoke, in a clean new nursery above conduits that had been inspected and sealed and would never again leak their slow poison into the air, a child made her first deliberate chromogenic response. A warm, particular amber that Tehari developmental physicians describe as the biological signature of contentment, and slept on.